and Summer of Rock.
Good times and great oldies. Cool, baby.
You can't see it, you can't feel it, you can't sense it in any way.
And if you don't see it or smell it, why worry?
Electromagnetic radiation has not been shown to cause cancer.
See, the problem is you don't know.
These are the unwarranted fears of a handful of hysterics.
Primary brain tumors in America have increased fourfold.
Cancer mortality, with the exception of lung cancer, which is smoking-related, has been coming down since the late 1960s and coming down sharply.
It is an exciting new technology which dramatically improves picture resolution.
But at what cost? And who is paying it? Who is paying the bill?
There is no relationship between human exposure to radio frequency energy and our cancer experience.
Science and government are saying that until you can bring us the bodies, we won't do anything.
Our group has made offers to some folks up there to buy land. And if they're so worried about their health concerns, why haven't they sold? It's a fair price.
It's against this background of conflicting statements that I'm drawn into the dispute. A group of broadcasters in Denver, including the affiliates of NBC, ABC, CBS, PBS, and UPN, a coalition called the Lake Cedar Group, face a mandate from the Federal Communications Commission to begin high-definition television broadcasts. To accomplish that, the broadcasters propose a new tower, residents call it a super tower, at the Lookout Mountain Antenna Farm, 2,000 feet above the city. Their plan also calls for removing 4 older towers as other radio and TV transmitters are moved onto the super tower. Fearing increased radiation, the citizens of Lookout Mountain oppose the broadcasters' plan.
Well, first of all, it wouldn't reduce the radiation in the community. We've looked at that. It would not. Secondly, we know their track record. We know they say one thing about it being within the limits, and when we study the facts, we find it's not.
Clearly, these are savvy people who seem to have done their homework. For balance, I talk with Roger Ogden, the station manager at Channel 9, the NBC affiliate in Denver.
So they developed a telecommunications policy. And one of the key tenets of that policy was we want to see consolidation of all those towers at Lookout Mountain among the broadcasters on one tower. When digital television came along, about 5 years ago, we went back to the county and said, here's the catalyst for doing that. And we're willing, as a group of broadcasters who compete pretty fiercely day in and day out, to come together and put together a proposal to build a common tower in which we'll consolidate many of these towers. And so from the beginning, we thought we were doing exactly what the county wanted us to do. It was part of the policy, so it clearly was what they wanted us to do.
And lo and behold, a group comes along and basically says, the County Commission's telecommunications plan is not satisfactory to us, and therefore we, the citizens group, will oppose that. Now, the other thing is, I believe that this is not about safety, this is not about aesthetics necessarily. I think it's about property values. I think if you consider that you own a piece of land with a majestic view of the city of Denver and the plains, and you were successful in getting towers removed from that mountain, you'd be sitting on a pretty valuable piece of land.
As a filmmaker, I've worked with broadcasters for many years, ABC, CBS, and PBS. For the most part, they've been reasonable people, corporate but reasonable. I like to think of the broadcasters as fairly hardcore journalists. You know, the 60 Minutes 2020 guys, who tell us the truth about plutonium and cigarettes and Agent Orange. I also have friends who live on Lookout Mountain, and they too seem like reasonable people. What possesses them to take on a coalition of broadcasters, however, does raise questions about their better judgment.
You have to stop and say to yourself, are we we've become a little paranoid? Is this crazy imaginings? And when you do a little research, you realize it's not. It's because you stop and think when you're fighting this kind of fight. Who do you go to? You go to the media who you hope is sympathetic and will help you educate the public and decision makers about the value of what you're saying.
This is shaping up as your basic David and Goliath struggle. Just look at the coalition. Channel 9, the NBC affiliate, is owned by Gannett, which owns hundreds of radio and TV stations and newspapers around the country. Channel 7, the ABC affiliate in Denver, is one of 12 stations owned by the publishing giant McGraw-Hill. Channel 4, the CBS affiliate, is a division of Westinghouse. And then there's PBS, the home of both Barney and Jim Lehrer. The broadcasters are prepared to spend over $2 million to get their land on Lookout Mountain rezoned for the new super tower. The residents of Lookout Mountain will fight them with hard work and community spirit.
$25. All right. 25. Do I hear 27?
This is where corporate America meets the bake sale.
27. All right.
By and large, the Lookout Mountain citizens are smart and well-educated. They include attorneys, an aerospace engineer, a retired professor of electrical engineering, mothers and community organizers, writers, inventors, government workers, and more mothers. Lots of mothers. Like many products of the 60s, these folks are inclined to question authority. In this case, they question the facts, the figures, the experts, the science of the experts, as well as the intentions and integrity of the media giants.
If any other industry was perpetrating this type of industrial environmental hazard on a neighborhood like ours, the media would be all over the story. But in this case, the perpetrators are the media. And that is why the general public has very little knowledge of the potential environmental hazards.
Growing levels of radio frequency radiation are seen in every city in the nation. In many cities, there are concerns about the placement of towers and the radiation they emit. But according to the FCC, Lookout Mountain has the highest levels of electromagnetic radiation of any community in the United States. Susan Marcus takes the threat very personally.
I got concerned when I realized that from our house to the Lookout Mountain Towers, there was a line of cancers that I could identify. Since we moved to our house, which is the gray house down there, my husband was diagnosed and treated for leukemia, which is one of the cancers that's associated with this kind of radiation. Our neighbors directly next to us, behind us, towards the towers, Pete Bates has been struggling with a cancer of the face and neck and here. And as you cross the street, there's the Gersler house. Marcus Gersler was diagnosed and died of a brain tumor. And then as you keep going directly across from them towards the towers, a gentleman died of a brain tumor, I think about 4 years ago. And then as you cross that street, you're directly on the ridge line towards the tower. Someone online died of cancer not too long ago. It's too much to be a coincidence.
Jack Lambiat is the chief engineer for Clear Channel Broadcasting, which has 3 FM antennas on Lookout Mountain. He sees the new super tower as a solution to the existing problems.
For the sake of argument, say we consolidate all of the FMs and all of the TVs onto one tower. And then in 7 years, when the VHF spectrum goes away, which has already been sold by the government, that's going to happen. Our national debt depends on that spectrum being sold. And we're confident that with an improved antenna design, higher placement, and closer monitoring than what's been done over the past 2 decades on this mountain, we're confident that we can establish a safe and effective broadcast position.
Former cameraman and director Jim Lilja takes issue with the citizens' protest.
Oh, that's a tough one. As I understand it, by and large, the TV towers were there before a lot of the present housing was there. And if that's true, then I think the broadcasters has every right to be up there. I think it would be fair to say this is not unlike somebody who chooses to build a house next to an airport and then complains about the noise from the jet airplanes.
It's a common perception that the towers were here first, that the people came later, and it's just simply not true. There were 350 homes up here when the first tower went in 1953.
Carol Lomond, publisher of City and Mountain Views, has written extensively on the history of the tower farm on Lookout Mountain.
This whole area was platted for homes by 1924. The population grew as the towers grew. In 1979, there was an estimated 100 transmission devices up here. And in 1996, it's been estimated that there are about 450. The population went from 350 in 1953 to presently 3,000. And half of those 3,000 family homes are at the same altitude as the transmission devices.
What Lookout Mountain residents are concerned about is the electromagnetic radiation coming from the radio and television antennas. To better understand this, here's a quick refresher on radiation. X-rays and gamma rays fall at the high end of the electromagnetic spectrum. They're an ionizing form of radiation which is capable of damaging cells without heating them. At the other end of the spectrum is non-ionizing radiation. It includes visible light, microwaves, and signals from cell phones, television, and radio transmitters. Experts agree that non-ionizing radiation at high intensities can cause adverse health effects by heating the body, what's known as the thermal effect. That's why we have standards for leakage from microwave ovens and for radiation from broadcast antennas. We can divide electromagnetic radiation into 4 categories. One category is radiation that is athermal, meaning it does not heat the body, but is ionizing, meaning it can damage cells. An example would be X-rays. Another category is radiation that both heats the body and damages cells. An example would be extensive exposure to X-rays. All ionizing radiation is strictly regulated. A third category is non-ionizing radiation at a high enough intensity to heat the body. Very intense exposure to radio and TV signals are examples of this type of radiation. All these categories have been studied extensively and standards have been set to limit human exposure to such radiation. What Lookout Mountain residents are concerned about is the 4th category, non-ionizing radiation that is not intense enough to heat the body. Relatively little research has been conducted on the biological effects of chronic exposure to this type of radiation. The FCC safety standard for broadcast antennas in the United States depends on frequency and is at least 200 microwatts per square centimeter. This standard is based on the belief that there's no harmful effect at levels too low to cause a thermal effect. But other governments have much more stringent standards, and some scientists now believe they can show cell damage even when there is short-term exposure at levels well below the current FCC standard.
The EPA program that had existed for setting standards was entirely abolished in EPA. Supposedly, there's a small group of safety people at the FCC that worry about these things, but there's not much evidence that they're putting out standards.
Roger Mattson has worked for 35 years in the field of nuclear and radiation safety. During the early 80s, he was a director of a division at the EPA with responsibility for the oversight of non-ionizing radiation.
Our economic boom in America is largely driven by this technology. Cell phones and microwave ovens, and nobody has raised the question of how much is enough or how safe is enough for this technology.
Prompted by Lohman's articles documenting that the antenna farm has grown from 1 tower with a couple of antennas in 1953 to 19 towers and more than 450 antennas in 1999, Al Hislop, an electrical engineer and Lookout Mountain resident, buys a radio frequency survey meter and begins taking measurements.
Nobody in the area really had a good idea about what was going on, what were the items that were causing the real problems in the neighborhood, whether there were TV stations or FM.
Hislop finds 5 locations at the Lookout Mountain Antenna Farm that exceed the FCC limits, some by as much as 250%. After frequent complaints to the FCC filed by the residents and repeated denials by the broadcasters that they're operating over the established limit, Dr. Robert Cleveland of the FCC comes to Denver to settle the dispute. He's accompanied by Bob Weller, the engineer working for the broadcasters, whose measurements had showed that the towers were in compliance.
A couple basic procedural questions. My understanding is you rarely come out and do this, measure this. Why are you out here today?
We do this when there's a problem that can't be resolved otherwise. We don't have the funding or the resources to go out and routinely make these measurements.
The citizens are measuring one thing and the stations are measuring
Well,
another?
there seems to be not complete agreement about what exactly are the exposure limits in these public areas. So in order to try to resolve that, that's why we're here. And the other reason is it turns out that the money to come out here is not too expensive because there's some government airfares, for example, to Denver that are reasonable. But we don't have a lot of money.
Who's responsible for monitoring?
As far as routine monitoring, I can't guarantee that there is any, going to be any.
The county then being the jurisdiction?
Well, if the county wanted to, they could. They could come over here, and if they found a problem, then they could notify us.
Essentially, there's no provision for monitoring. So when you say that if there's evidence of a problem, there really wouldn't be any evidence of a problem unless...
Well, unless somebody came and did a
somebody
measurement,
came out
or
and did it.
if, for example, somebody did some new calculations, maybe somebody decided there was something wrong here that hadn't been properly analyzed previously.
Okay, I'll cut to the chase here. I'm 5 months pregnant. Should I not be here?
If we're over the limit here, you shouldn't be here longer than 30 minutes.
Okay.
Or let's put it that way, according to the standards.
As the day progresses, it becomes apparent to Cleveland that the broadcaster's consultant had overlooked all the hot spots Hislop had found. Electromagnetic radiation levels on Lookout Mountain are clearly out of compliance.
What about up there? Did you go on that road? where
Yeah,
you found the hot
yeah,
spots?
absolutely.
You didn't find any of this?
Oh, I found these spatially peak hot spots, but I did not find anything that was spatially averaged. And I surveyed this.
It seems like if a couple of amateurs can go out and do it in 2 hours, that professionals over a matter of years ought to be able to pick this up.
I was here for 2 days, and I covered virtually every inch up here. I definitely would not have missed this.
Not only are the broadcasters caught out of compliance, it's revealed that the FCC and the county have relied on measurements submitted by the broadcasters. It's a classic case of the fox guarding the henhouse. To the residents, it was finally clear that no one, not the county, not the FCC, not the broadcasters, was looking after their safety. They respond with outrage.
This amount of radiation they are hitting us with, when it starts to change our bodily functions, change our own brain waves, break our DNA, if they think that they can just sit there and have no responsibility for that, they are out of their minds.
We recognized we had a potential issue up there because we didn't have clear-cut zoning, that we were sort of in there on grandfathered zoning that allowed the construction of those towers on agricultural land years and years ago, and it never had been clarified. And as we went further along, we saw that the community opposition began to grow, that the concerns were expressed about radiation levels and a variety of different things. And frankly, through the process, we did our best to address those issues in a way that the community up there would understand.
The towers are perched on a ridge far above the city of Denver. But unlike most broadcasting towers, they are surrounded by terrain of equal or higher elevation. At these higher elevations are the Ralston Elementary School and hundreds of homes, directly in the stream of radiation from the antennas.
I'm not a...
You're not a what?
Lab rat.
The petition with signatures was something that had been accumulated over a period of several weeks, and it was over 3,000 signatures from homeowners who were wanting to let the commissioners know that they were not happy with what was happening with radiation levels on Lookout, and they did not want any additional radiation on Lookout Mountain.
We had a gut feeling that we had an unusually high number of brain cancers here, proving that this high number of brain cancers was caused by any particular thing, such as the radiation, is difficult.
We've done a lot of the work anyway.
One step the steering committee can take is to find and document people who've been diagnosed with cancer and other malignancies.
I actually don't want to believe that living in a paradise like this causes cancer.
And we thought that we had found the home of our dreams.
The mountainous terrain, we were both avid runners.
And I've lived here 34 years.
26 years. And when I heard non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, I just started to shake.
Diagnosed with a malignant brain tumor, primary site. It was called a glioblastoma, technically.
She was diagnosed as having a glioblastoma.
I believe strongly in sound scientific evidence. I'm not prepared at this point to say where the cancer came from.
Something I can't put my finger on. Could it be electromagnetic radiation? Maybe. Maybe so. I wish I could nail it down.
And when I heard non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, I just started to shake.
That's been something I've been thinking about ever since last summer when I had surgery performed.
Marcus was 34 years old when he passed away.
It's a cancer of the lymph system. It's not operable, treated through chemotherapy and radiation. It's what King Hussein just died of. The king and I.
Despite strong suspicions and compelling testimonials, the evidence of the citizens is anecdotal and far from scientific. Their claims that the FCC standards are weak and rarely enforced strongly differs with the broadcaster's point of view. Jack Lambiat.
I've met many of these engineers and scientists who've been involved with the research of RF study, and I've heard their arguments in zoning and planning meetings, and I think their credibility holds. I trust what they say. And since I work on these transmitters, a large part of my professional life, I have a vested interest myself in maintaining my own health. If I felt it was a dangerous environment, I wouldn't be working up there.
But the FCC says it's safe.
The safety standard appears to me that it is based on acute, that's short-term, health effects, not based on long-term risk of cancer, quote. And none of the material I saw was presented would make me think that's the kind of standard that is being used. This is from the Chief Medical Officer of the state of Colorado. And he says further, all we can tell is that this 200 microwatts per square centimeter is a standard based on acute, short-term health effects, which is exactly what we're saying.
The American Cancer Society has looked at it and seen no correlation. The CDC in Atlanta, Colorado Health Department, these folks have significant credentials. I mean, they're not, they have serious credentials in studying this kind of thing. So we look to the studies, we hire the best consultants, and we've gotten answers that say things are okay, that there's no cause and effect there.
Blake Levitt, author of Electromagnetic Fields, A Consumer's Guide to the Issues, offers her perspective.
The problem is that it's very, very difficult, as you know, to prove cause and effect when it comes to the energy modalities. The brain tumors are probably going to begin, they probably already are, beginning to show up in cell phone users. It's going to take probably 10 to 15 years for it to show up in those who live near the cell towers, more than likely. And then it's going to take another 2 years to gather the data. It's going to take another 3 years for peer review. It's going to take another 4 years to end up in the journals. So we're 20 years away from holding this industry accountable. In the meantime, you do the math, there's billions of dollars at stake there that they're going to rake in, and they very cynically know how long it's going to take to prove this.
It strikes me that the residents of Lookout Mountain will have a tough time selling their point of view. In essence, they have fears that radiation from the antennas is causing DNA damage, which results in cancer. And even though they have no proof of this, they want the county commissioners to turn down the HDTV super tower, partly because of health concerns. If this is their pitch and they are going to match the well-orchestrated campaign of the Lake Cedar Group, they'll need to sharpen their attack and broaden their appeal. The place they decide to start is at home.
Come on, guys, coming in.
Community events, t-shirt sales, a graphics campaign, fundraisers, research, auctions, computer simulations, community education. This community will try anything. The hopes and dreams of the citizens are not hard to understand. This is a beautiful neighborhood, and the residents are deeply attached to the land. It's well worth fighting for. But there's an issue that evades me. With the exception of the hot spots that were found under the towers, electromagnetic levels in the neighborhoods are within the FCC limits. The broadcasters have shown that with the consolidation plan, and even with twice as much power radiating from the antennas, levels in residential areas will continue to be within the FCC limits.
Our commitment is to live by the standards that are the law of the land, and we will and have. There's not one member of this consortium that has ever been out of violation, or been out of the parameters, or in violation of those standards established by the FCC. We've always been within the parameters.
Living by the law is one thing, but will radiation levels in the neighborhoods go down with a new super tower?
I don't even know that I've seen test equipment accurate enough to measure RF exposure at a mile out from the tower. Typically, the levels at those distances from the tower are minuscule, and again, they are well below, in many cases, what's able to be even measured. Certainly, what's able to be reliably measured.
The current FCC standard is good enough for the broadcasters, but it's apparently not good enough for the residents of Lookout Mountain.
One might say, yes, we're within the standard. What standards are there for things other than health? Are there standards for interference? There are not standards for interference from television stations at this point.
There are alternative sites available that would basically put no residents at harm's risk.
Other concerns about tower fall, which are very real possibilities. Towers fall every day in this country, and they have fallen on Lookout Mountain as well.
So how much interference should people be required to experience? Why would they move more and more television into a residential area when interference is already a tremendous problem here? Why would they move television antennas, more antennas in here, when it's fairly well established that the movement of those antennas would decrease property values?
This is a problem in the ongoing discussion, is every time the broadcasters try and actually appear to have solved one problem, the issue moves to another problem, and you can't get a handle on what the issue really is. We've been put in a no-win situation here. An amortization strategy has been tried. It's clear to me that the effort is to try and remove the towers, and that's not a reasonable solution.
Responding to doubts that health arguments will hold much sway with the county commissioners, Lookout Mountain residents take me on a show-and-tell tour of interference problems at their homes and businesses.
We're getting noise coming through the speakers of the computers. We cannot work with our induction equipment, our electromagnetic coils.
I'm Sister Bernadette Cashano, and I'm the administrator at Mother Cabrini Shrine here in Golden. We use an electromagnetic gate opener in the morning and in the evening to provide safety for our facility. Frequently during the day, this gate closes automatically.
Is there any chance that this would be an act of God?
I doubt very much if it would be an act of God. That happens when we have electrical storms or lightning, but...
I just reached down and just went to hit the joystick to turn around and go back home, turned completely around to 180, and it took off.
Two people who were up visiting the nature center came here, and they had parked their Ford Explorers right where the station wagon is parked.
I went off the cliff, and they said that I went out about 6 feet before I ever started to descend.
Their cars wouldn't start.
You know, one lady's hearing aids. She can hear the radios on her hearing aids. That's like Chinese torture.
In both cases, we had to call the AAA.
The wheelchair came down and crushed my chest.
The water drip. You can never get away from this station because it's in your ear.
Hoping to work out a settlement between the Lookout Mountain residents and the broadcasters, the Jefferson Economic Council invites both factions to a roundtable meeting.
What I said was that I really feel, with the topography of our state, this metropolitan area being what it is, whether you like it or not, I think that these high mountain peaks are your finest broadcast sites.
My feeling was the broadcasters felt they were on safer ground with their proposal and were then less willing to look at common ground with the homeowners. So the meeting ended up pretty much as a frustration for everybody. But I do believe that there was an accommodation, but we could never get to that part of the conversation. Lines were so deeply drawn in the sand that it just became impossible.
That's a nice way of saying the event turned into an uncontrollable shouting match. The battle between broadcasters and the residents of Lookout Mountain turns bitter and personal.
I think the thing that I object to most is that we've got folks who don't have any business telling us how to engineer our broadcast facilities, ignoring the constraints we have to go through between all of these factions. And the conclusion is, well, there's another site, you can just move there. That's not true. It's not that easy.
The question of potential adverse health effects continues to dog the debate over a new tower. Several weeks before the case comes to the county commissioners, the Colorado Department of Health releases the results of its health study on the citizens of Lookout Mountain.
If I had a home up here, I would not sell it, and I would not hesitate to move up here because of this study.
Rumors had it that the report would show a cancer cluster resulting from radiation from the antenna farm. The study shows there is a cancer cluster on Lookout Mountain, but the citizens have hoped for evidence pointing to a connection between the clusters and the radiation. The study was not designed to find the cause of the cancers, but the media draws its own conclusions. To them, it's proof that the radiation on Lookout Mountain is benign. The Board of County Commissioners will meet on 3 separate days over 3 months to hear the broadcaster's application for the new super tower.
The testimony you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
You find that the populated portions of Lookout Mountain have RF levels which are many times below the national standard for human exposure, the standard you adopted and the standard that the FCC requires.
What happened to the homeowners in 3 Mile Island because they believed that their children were under risk? What happened to those people? They bailed out, and their property became virtually, absolutely worthless. But it was under the federal standard for nuclear radiation in the environment.
It appears that an undetected failure of one of my firm's meters prior to the 1997 measurements occurred, and this failure accounts for the discrepancy.
I happen to own the exact same make and model of measuring equipment that Mr. Weller had. And I know that that measuring equipment has built-in test equipment which is designed to show the operator if a malfunction has occurred.
Responding to pleas from residents for a more complete health study on the Lookout Mountain cancer clusters, Representative John Whitwer submits a bill to the Colorado Senate calling for a detailed study. The study will have an open account and will not require state funds. Claiming the health study is nothing more than a stall tactic, the broadcasters and their consultants lobby hard against the bill.
The question that we would ask you to ask yourselves is, are they based on solid evidence and good science? You're going to have somewhere on the order of 2 million Front Range viewers saying, why don't we have it here when they have it in Seattle and Portland and San Francisco, et cetera?
It's risk versus benefit day to day. So we're looking at the health hazard to the community, both real and perceived, versus the benefit here, which is better resolution on a TV screen.
It was a national collaborative study done by the National Cancer Institute of the United States of America in 8 centers around the United States. It was categorically negative. It found no evidence whatever linking ELF to childhood leukemia.
Senator Hernandez?
No.
By an overwhelming majority, the broadcasters convinced the Senate subcommittee to abandon the new health study. Residents of Lookout Mountain take the defeat personally.
If this is so safe, why kill the research?
We're dealing with a type of pollution that can cause people to die. That's serious stuff. I mean, that's serious stuff. I mean, this isn't like cigarette smoke, where if you don't want to be around cigarette smoke, you move to another room. Or, you know, here, you're exposed to this stuff whether you want to be or not.
It's made me very cynical about the media. It's made me very cynical about, you know, whether they really are there to serve the public good or whether they aren't just huge corporations there to serve themselves.
You know, I think it's unfortunate that this has become so polarized so quickly. You have some individuals up there who've now turned this into a career, and they're very emotional about it. It's difficult to have a rational conversation. And I think the solution here ultimately is a rational conversation around a compromise that makes sense for both parties. And I'm hopeful that at some point we'll reach that stage.
What the citizens lack is conclusive scientific evidence to support their claims of a health hazard. They turn to Blake Levitt for an explanation.
There is no American research that is being funded by the government. There is no disinterested party funding research in America. You can't find what you're not looking for. The reason that the telecommunications researchers for the CTIA, the researchers for the WTR, went on strike for a year until the industry indemnified their research, the reason that they did that is because they saw what was happening to the researchers for the Tobacco Institute who are being named as individuals in these lawsuits. What they wanted was complete indemnification for that in perpetuity because they know what's happening behind the scenes.
The citizens find themselves in the unique position of having virtually no support from the regulatory agencies. There's no one to trust. The FCC has shown little interest in protecting the safety of the residents, and the county has for years allowed new towers and antennas to be added to Lookout Mountain without permits.
When the government sets standards, it has to set them with knowledge of what is happening or what may happen, and this requires research. But the government has not done any significant experiments on what the chronic exposure at low levels does to people.
I do know that we've been on the air broadcasting in this country for 50 years, and that is a long-term situation. If there were a chronic problem, you would have seen it by now. When they took a look at cigarette smoking and asbestos and all, and I don't believe there's a parallel between these things. A problem showed up early on. Scientists saw a problem early on and took years to verify that there was indeed a problem. With broadcasting's been around for 50 years. There appears not to be an apparent problem early on, unlike some of these other situations. I mean, that's the way the scientific process is. You discover it early on, then you spend a lot of time trying to verify or disprove what's happening.
Through networking and research, Deb Carney finds Dr. Henry Lai, one of the few independent scientists in the United States studying the biological effects of electromagnetic radiation.
I have a paper that will be published in Bioelectromagnetics, I think within 2 or 3 months, that shows that intensity and duration can trade with each other. That means low intensity, long duration is equal to high intensity, short duration exposure.
This is the information the residents are looking for. The research of Dr. Lai and others gives the citizens new ammunition in their debate with the broadcasters.
Take a look at our own government's track record of saying something's safe and then discovering after the fact, oops, well, it wasn't so safe.
All right, well, given the unanticipated problems that have been found with ionizing radiation since World War II, and things like DDT, things like tobacco, one would wonder, why not just take the prudent step of avoiding exposure if you can?
There's no parallel here. There have been lots and lots of studies of radiation, and there have been standards established relative to what's safe for human beings, and we're within compliance of those issues. And so we don't see a situation where somehow there's some future liability based upon some future discovery. As long as we're operating within the law, the standards that are prevalent, then we don't see a liability issue in the future. And frankly, there are many, many, many cities in this country in which television stations operate from buildings right in the heart of the city. If you go to New York, the Empire State Building has significantly greater radiation coming from it than these towers do. And the Empire State Building is at a lower level than the World Trade Center, as an example. And so you have a direct sort of radiation pattern. This is not a unique situation here. And in fact, there are many situations in which the population either lives or works in much closer proximity to similar towers than we have on Lookout Mountain.
If radio frequency causes cancer in human beings, I don't know how. It is virtually certainly not a DNA disruptor. I understand that that has been disputed by a care expert. And I would only point out that the position that it cannot disrupt DNA is the consensus opinion.
Dr. Cole is the health effects poster boy for the entire electromagnetic radiation industry. His career was marked with many years as being associated with the Electric Power Research Institute, which is the power industry's equivalent of the Tobacco Institute, performing, quote, independent, industry-funded research on the effects of the product which they sell. With Dr. Cole and Mr. Cohen, you have not heard independent science.
Dr. Ross Wilkins is an orthopedic oncologist and president of the Musculoskeletal Tumor Society. He attended the Lookout Mountain hearings.
The basic defect that we see in all of cancer has to do with DNA damage. And it's been shown unequivocally in hundreds of studies that the same radiation that comes off those towers causes DNA damage. And when the DNA is damaged, you can lose control of cell growth, and that thus causes cancer. And that is a scientific fact. And for someone to sit there and say, don't worry about it, it has no effect, is absolutely ludicrous.
2 years after Robin McLaughlin lost her husband to leukemia, 2 of her golden retrievers die of leukemia.
I took my dogs to see a specialist, an oncologist who specializes in treating cancer in dogs, and with the first case, she said that it wasn't unusual to see a young dog with lymphoma, and it's usually real aggressive in young dogs, so I expected pretty much the course that played itself out. But when my second dog was diagnosed, she said that it was pretty much an anomaly, that she had never seen litter mates with lymphoma. So I called the person that I purchased the dogs from, who lives locally, and asked her if any of the other litter mates, there were 8 dogs in the litter, if any of those had been diagnosed with cancer, and none of them had. My experience was significant enough to me that everybody I had moved into that house with died of cancer, and that was enough to make me feel like I wanted to leave.
And so did you?
I left, yeah. I sold my house and I moved across the highway.
Citizens hope that stories like Robin McLaughlin's will help them win favorable treatment by the press. It doesn't happen. The majority of editorials come down on the side of the broadcasters.
The thrust of my column is simply this. Maybe there are excessive electromagnetic radiation emissions from the towers. Maybe there aren't. But if I even slightly suspected that there were, and that they could affect the health and well-being of me and my family, I'd move. Even if I had to take an economic loss, I would move. And partly because of that, I just don't buy the explanations of people who say, we think this is killing us prematurely, taking out a large segment of the population here in our neighborhood, but we're going to fight it, we're not going to move. And there's a bigger issue than a political fight like that, and that's life and death.
We think this is a matter of life and death, but we're not going to run from it. And we're not going to pass this off to some unsuspecting people that would move in if we all sold our houses and ran.
And guess what? We are up against big business and big government who has lots of money to lobby, and it's no different than the tobacco industry, except that we don't have the media on our side at all.
In spite of their failure to win the support of Denver's major newspapers, Lookout Mountain supporters dig in. They now believe the only solution to the radiation problems is to remove all the towers from residential Lookout Mountain to less populated sites. The question of alternate sites seems pivotal to the debate. Inspired to see for myself, I visit the El Dorado Antenna Farm, located on an 8,000-foot mountain between Golden and Boulder. Bill Schuler is the owner.
This is the only site along the Front Range that you can look right into Denver, you can look right into Boulder, and you can look right into Golden.
And nobody lives here.
Except myself. We are about 1,000 feet above the towers on Lookout Mountain, so we do have a little higher elevation. But we stand out so far that I think, arguably, we are either equal to or possibly even considered a little better than the coverage on Lookout Mountain.
Another possible site is Squaw Peak, an 11,000-foot mountain 12 miles west of Evergreen. I speak with the owner, Tom Barron.
Squaw has elected not to construct its towers to the elevation permitted by Clear Creek County because then we would have to paint and light them. We take into consideration the fact that we want to be as low impact as possible.
Squaw Mountain is on 30 acres with national forest on two sides of it. So there can't be any development behind it or off to the side of it.
Station manager Roger Ogden and the broadcasters find flaws with the other sites.
I think there are two issues there. One is that, we've done several studies that show that the alternate sites are anywhere from slightly inferior to significantly inferior to Lookout Mountain. None of them are quite as good. And then as business people, we own land up there. We've made significant investment in that infrastructure for a lot of years. We've consolidated the property of all of the television members of this consortium. And for us to walk away from that investment for no good reason simply doesn't make good business sense. So there are really two reasons why an alternative site doesn't make sense to us.
We would love to move and cut our losses. If we thought we could, we would move. But the losses of moving are just too great. It would put us out of business.
It's a not in my backyard kind of situation. Where if we move to Clear Creek, you're going to have, there's a citizens group there. If you move to El Dorado, there's a citizens group in Boulder. This is something nobody wants. And yet, if we were to shut down, people would start wondering about their over-the-air broadcast television, which is free to the public. And there's a significant percentage of the population that doesn't get cable or satellite. So we still have a viable argument here as far as staying on the air.
The final decision will be made at the third and final hearing before the county commissioners. The broadcasters and the residents both feel confident that they have presented convincing evidence to support their case. In the final arguments, both sides do everything they can to tip the scales.
This is my life and this is my home, as well as to many other people. And I think it's a small price to pay.
The companion question you have to ask yourself is, how can the leading TV stations in Denver, who basically live and die by public goodwill, propose in good faith something that would have that kind of a health effect?
They treat our concerns about our health with contempt. They've exceeded FCC standards. They write letters to the general community describing us as fanatics and other misleading comments. What happens if the towers become the predominant neighbors on Lookout Mountain? Do you think the good neighbors will stay? I don't think so.
A fair reading, a fair and balanced reading of what we're proposing is that this proposal makes things better, way better. And that's why I believe that we firmly meet our burden of proof under any standard for rezoning. It's also why we've enjoyed editorial support from a number of papers, including the Post and News. It's why we received a 6-to-1 recommendation of approval from the Planning Commission, and it's why I would ask you to do the same and to approve it. Thank you for your time and consideration.
Based on the concerns of tower fall, incompatibility with the residential environment, and violation of zoning regulations, the Jefferson County Commissioners reject the zoning change for the HDTV Super Tower.
Hey, let's go to Disneyland.
So there you have it. The initial victory is won by the residents of Lookout Mountain, but there's no resolution. The broadcasters don't plan to move off the mountain, and the residents still face radiation from the 450 antennas in their backyard.
We have spent over $2 million chasing our tail in legal and engineering. This station alone has spent $400,000 in legal and engineering to try and solve the problem. We've come full circle, back around to a no, that we cannot build. And we have nothing to show for it. And we believe that we have, in the best of intent, met the specifications of the Jefferson County Telecommunications Plan.
I think the solution here ultimately is a rational conversation around a compromise that makes sense for both parties. And I'm hopeful that at some point we'll reach that stage.
Do you think a compromise is possible?
I think that a compromise for putting more signals on Lookout Mountain is not possible. It's time to move on. We've seen, I think, really that an industrial use of a residential neighborhood is not working out.
There's a win-win here, I know it. I know there's a win-win here, but I believe that there is a faction on Lookout Mountain that wishes the towers to go away, and I don't believe that's going to happen. We have to come to a middle ground, a reasonable solution, some reasoned approach on where everybody wins.
Can there be a compromise?
Given my experience, I'd have to say that there can't be a compromise.
Now we have status quo, which isn't, according to the homeowners, good either. So we don't have an improved situation, we have the same situation.
As a filmmaker, I'd like to see this end with clear-cut victory for one side or the other. You know, a story which arouses passions and fires the imagination. There's no chance of that. This has ended in a partisan stalemate which is frustrating and unsettling. Experts say it may be 15 or 20 years before we have conclusive scientific evidence one way or the other. The broadcasters say they will continue trying to work out a compromise with the residents. I don't know what the Lookout Mountain residents will do. What should any of us do faced with the uncertainty on long-term exposure to electromagnetic radiation?
No, there's nobody looking out for the safety nationwide. And if citizens are worried about the safety, they're going to have to do what this community in Jefferson County, Colorado did, which is look out for themselves.